I blew it by asking an extra question at the end, but can I thank you very much for coming along this morning to help us in taking evidence on our sanctions report. Can I start with you, Ben? Can you perhaps introduce yourselves for the record, please?
Sure. Ben Robinson, Head of Policy at Community Links.
Mark Serwotka, the General Secretary of PCS.
Helen, Flanagan, PCS NEC member and Vice President of the DWP Group.
David Stuckler, Oxford University.
Steve Hughes, Head of Economic and Social Policy at Policy Exchange.
Okay, thank you very much, and you're all very welcome. And this first set of questions is from Sheila Gilmore.
Good morning, thank you. I wanted to ask Steve, in particular, I think there was a statement in the 2014 report that suggested that at times the regime was too lenient on people who had repeatedly failed to keep to their regime, but sometimes too stringent on those who had made a single mistake. Could you perhaps, explain a bit more about that?
So I think, firstly, taking the too stringent point, which was in relation to the evidence that you've heard and seen a lot of, which is that those people receiving a sanction could be going through a system whereby it gets overturned, and there's quite a high proportion of people getting their sanction overturned, and that engagement is very important for job seekers and those people on job seekers allowance in understanding the sanctions. So what we suggested was that instead of having a financial sanction for a lower tier first offence, as it were, instead of having a financial sanction, we could test and pilot non-financial sanctions. So in the case where we've obviously got a lot of evidence that people go into food banks because of sanctions, hopefully that financial impact would no longer occur, because instead the benefit would be paid in a different format to recognise that offence had occurred, but it would still be paid. The second element of that was another part of the non-financial conditionality, which would be engaging with the job centre a bit more. So we recommended daily sign-on for a period of 8 weeks, and that would attempt to overcome the problems of people not engaging and just dropping out of the system, being able to access a job centre advisor where they'd be able to be told about hardship loans, for example, and the appeals process. So that was the first part of it, and on the second part of it, where making things more stringent, the argument essentially was that there are a very small proportion of people within the overall piece that are repeatedly being flouting the sanction system. And we recognise within the reports that we don't actually know much about these people. Now, if it's repeated flouting because for not good enough reasons, then that might indicate that sanctions should then be increased proportionally for every sanction. If it wasn't for that, and we found out it was something different or some other problems with that particular claimant, then that might not be suitable. But ultimately, the idea was a more proportional system, starting with non-financial sanctions, with increasing financial sanctions as offences increase.
I mean, is there a risk that people who have long periods of sanction, and they may be, obviously they're a smaller number, we know that, simply drop out of the system somewhere, and therefore aren't in contact with the job centre?
I think that's certainly a risk, and I think it's one of the many areas of sanctions and conditionality policy that we simply just don't know that much about, and that's why we said, well, don't implement this system all in one go or anything like that. It's something or an idea to test and pilot, as we should do with all aspects of welfare policy, which is a test and learn approach.
I mean, if someone's sanctioned, say, for 3 months, what is the incentive for them, particularly, to seek help or go on trying? I mean, did you look into that at all, whether people during that period actually disengage rather than re-engage?
Well, my reading of the evidence is that some people can disengage and other people can engage, and they will come back into the system as well. But again, as I say, I think the evidence is pretty sketchy and we just don't know much about it. And that's one of the things that the DWP should be looking into, is to what is happening to those people on longer periods of sanction, to see where they're going and what they're doing, because until we know that, we can't improve the system.
The aim of this, the stated aim of this, and I think your organisation would hold to this, is to encourage people to get employment, and that sanctions will be part of that role. Do you think we have sufficient knowledge as to whether that actually works?
No, in short, because I think, as I said before, the evidence is patchy and it's from all over the world, with welfare systems that interact with each other in very different ways depending on where you look at them. I think there's a strong case for a system of conditionality and a conditionality system backed up by sanctions, but it's more about the fairness of the application of those sanctions rather than necessarily whether they exist in the first place.
Do you think we should be having some sort of proper independent review of the system at this stage?
Yeah, I do, but I would, again, going back to my previous answer, I would be reticent to say look at the sanction system as to whether to kind of blow it up entirely, and rather have kind of Oakley style reviews of certain elements of the system where we know there's a problem. And we know there's a problem within the numbers of cancellations of referral decisions, because we can see that just simply by looking at a graph. We know there's a problem looking at the number of appeals that go through that are successful, because it's quite a high proportion of those decisions that are made. And I think we know there's a problem with the interaction of providers and Job Centre Plus as well. And I'd advocate independent reviews on really those three aspects. I mean, if you look back at the impact assessment that came alongside the Welfare Reform Act, there are a lot of references in that to the fact that we just simply don't know what the behavioural change will be for some of these changes, and therefore that necessitates us looking into these kind of things further down the line after the policy's been implemented.
But surely part of the problem is sort of implement the policy with a statement that this will work, and then in effect we're kind of experimenting on people a bit, are we?
I'm not entirely sure whether that's the case. I mean, if you look at the broad evidence, you can say, well, there's a system and there's a framework for a system, and within that system we've got problems further on down the line, and therefore we need to test what's wrong with those problems. The problem is that we've got problems and we don't really know what's causing them.
But those three areas that you've outlined, do you think are ones that are worth digging into, and the department should be
absolutely,
doing?
And I actually think there's probably pretty broad consensus on those three areas. Whether that's the focus of those three areas of the focus of a review is a different question, but I think there would be consensus on there's problems in those three areas, definitely.
Okay. Paul.
Thank you. Helen, talk a bit about the claimant commitment, which has been presented by the government as a step forward in terms of the job seeker claimant understanding what the nature of their conditionality is. How do you think the claimant commitment has worked in practice in terms of capturing people's different capacities for work, different challenges they may face in overcoming hurdles to get to work? How is it functioning as it's been rolled out in your view?
Claimant commitment itself is a lot more complicated than the job seekers agreement. It's supposed to be much more tailored to the individual, but in reality we find it's got many more steps that the claimant has to take each week. I think it was referred to before, people mentioned that you might have to apply for 3 jobs a week, whereas under the claimant commitment it lays out individual steps. So for example, looking on a website 3 times a week, that would become 3 steps. So you could have a claimant commitment where there's over 40 steps that that individual has to do each week, and they may well be actively looking for work, but for instance if they look at Reed website, which is an employer website, rather than Indeed, which is on their claimant commitments, they can be referred to decision maker on that issue. So we find in practice, although some advisors, some claimants say that they will commit, in another sense it's much more complicated for the individual to fully understand what they're required to do in order to meet the conditions.
And do you think that, so therefore, are you suggesting the variability in individual claimant commitments is around the actions taken or that they need to take, rather than their individual circumstances. That's not making them more complex.
It's both really, and we find that some claimants don't fully understand, and that's down to their individual circumstances. Despite the fact that it's meant to be tailored, we still have examples, anecdotal examples, where our members have been told that they're not meeting the district standard for claimant commitments. Now, if there's a standard, that gives you the impression that's a template. So therefore, they're not tailored. There are a number of steps that have been told that they have to be there for each person, so it's not tailored to the individual.
If someone arrives with a diagnosed mental health condition at the Job Centre Plus, what steps are taken to ensure that the claimant commitment is tailored to their specific needs, and perhaps more importantly, that the individual claimant understands the ramifications of what they are signing? And do you have examples of where people won't sign because they are concerned they won't be able to fulfil the commitment?
Generally, people do sign a claimant commitment, but they may not realise the full implications of what they're signing. In terms of people with mental health problems or other underlying conditions, there are relaxations, there are flexibilities that can be put into that claimant commitment in terms of looking for work or hours available, for example, but the staff either or don't know or are simply not encouraged to put those flexibilities in there for each claimant. There are specialist advisors, disability employment advisors, but those are very small in number, normally with quite large caseloads. So by the time they're actually referred, if they are indeed referred to a disability employment advisor, those flexibilities won't have been put in there.
So if you're suggesting that the system in some way militates against making the claimant commitment as flexible as it needs to be, is that a factor of time available for individual advisors, or that they simply don't have the time to do it, or is it more structural than that?
I would say it's more structural because as I said, it's more of a focus on what should be a standard claimant commitment. So they're not encouraged to tailor according to individual needs, especially those with health needs, or those need to have some kind of part-time working for childcare needs as well.
Do you think perhaps that almost quite a significant policy change has occurred without people noticing it, in that we now assume that to be a job seeker is analogous to having a full-time job, i.e. you are spending 35 hours a week searching for a job, so therefore a job seeker is now a job, if you like. If that has occurred, would you therefore agree that it might be therefore sensible that just as in any other job, the employee can try to ensure that the job is flexible enough to meet their own personal needs, that same should apply to a job seeker if they are doing something analogous to a full-time job?
Well,
Does that make sense?
Not particularly,
No.
but
it makes sense to me. I know what I mean. I apologise.
In other words, if you've got a full-time job
Yeah.
and you have some health problems,
Yeah.
there might be flexibilities in the job.
yeah.
And I suppose the same, should that same kind of flexibility reflected in the claimant commitment?
Yeah.
I think is that
That's essentially what I mean.
I don't know if that helps.
That is what I mean. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that should be there in terms
Yeah.
of what you do in order to look for work, as well as what you'd be expected to work for. But it's not. I don't think it's a hidden policy change in terms of looking for a job as a full-time job. That's the mantra that's repeated.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that was in the universal credit legislation. That is the 35-hour-a-week job search. And even though it hasn't transferred over to job seekers allowance as yet, our experience is that staff have been told you've got to include that anyway.
Right.
There is no encouragement, as I said before, to tailor it to individual needs, especially those with health problems.
I know Mr Robertson, I know Community Links has said that they've been hoping the claimant commitment will see the claimant steering their journey towards work. Do you think the claimant commitment is delivering on that aspiration in your view?
It's still early days, but from our experience, that tailoring is still pretty patchy. We would say two things. We welcomed it because it should have given an opportunity for claimants to shape, so not deciding what steps they'd be taking, but having a greater input into where they wanted to go and what they could be expected to do. The other thing is that it should be a live document that should be regularly being updated and changed as claimant circumstances change. I'd say there's patchy evidence on both of those. We would urge much greater opportunities and guidance for advisors to allow people to shape it and to feed into that process. At the moment, we're seeing, as Helen described, just greater burdens being placed on people as a result of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Just back to you, Helen. In terms of job seekers' directions in particular, obviously pre-claimant commitment, they had a clear, distinct role. If the claimant commitment is meant to be specific to the individual, what role do you see for job seeker directions parallel to the claimant commitment? Should they actually exist now, really? Or should they all be incorporated in the claimant commitment?
They still exist. In fact, they're used more so now than they were before as part of the SR13 conditionality measures, which were introduced.
SR13?
The spending review.
Oh, the spending review.
That came in April.
This year's spending review, sorry.
April 2014 with the help to work measures as well. It introduced day one conditionality, it's called, where more directions were issued. There could be parallel to the claimant commitment, for example, creation of a CV or attending a workshop in the job centre. But they are used more ad hoc. There could be an argument that they're no longer needed, but they are used as a kind of immediate threat of sanction. So if you don't do this by this date, then you'll be referred to a decision maker.
And do you think it's made sufficiently clear that in addition to the obligations under the claimant commitment, job seeker directions are as liable to incur a sanction if not followed as the contents of a claimant commitment? Do you think that is blurring the picture for the average claimant?
I think in that first interview, when you hit with your claimant commitment and the direction, and maybe one or two directions, I think that's a lot to take in for an individual and to understand the consequences if you slip up in these areas. Or even if you slip up twice, you could face a 4-week or several month sanction. It is emphasised a lot. Conditionality is the main focus of all interviews, I would say, certainly the initial ones, but I don't think it's people have a fair opportunity to take that in.
Okay.
Helen, you said that most people sign their claimant commitment. Is that because they've got a fear that if they don't sign it, even though they might think it's inappropriate, that they'll be sanctioned? So that fear of sanctions is making them sign up for something that's inappropriate, and then the next stage is that something that they can't fulfil, therefore they're going to be sanctioned anyway. They'd be set up to fail almost.
Well, yes, basically. If they don't sign that claimant commitment, that instance gets referred to the decision maker. So if you are, you've lost your job and you're desperate for money, you don't want to kind of put that off any further, especially as you've now got increased waiting days for the benefit. You don't want to wait for that any longer than necessary, I would say. So you're probably under quite a lot of pressure yourself financially to think, well, I best just sign this so that I can get my payments. So
the sanction's almost built in, it's just been delayed then?
Can I just add very quick a case study that was in our submission? We worked with one gentleman who, in his first interview, asked for a sentence to be added to the claimant commitment that said, I'll attend all the training courses and interviews arranged for me, but only if such courses and activities will give me an advantage in finding work. And the job centre refused that additional sentence and consequently sanctioned him for not signing the claimant commitment.
Okay.
This is a 35-hour issue. I mean, ever since we've been discussing this, I've wondered how that can be evidenced in the sense that, and my fear, and it's comments perhaps not just both people working and elsewhere, my fear was that then itself becomes quite box ticking, because how do you assess whether somebody has spent the requisite time unless you're just making a judgment about, well, if you're spending that time, you should do so many things. It becomes quite... how do you judge whether somebody spent 35 hours a week on their job seeking?
I mean, this goes back to the kind of the point that I think Paul was asking about before, is that we believe that it should be an investment in the relationship between the advisor and the claimant. So if they work together and they spend that time to really understand their situation and the kind of activities they can be expected to do, then they'll be in a better position to be able to judge whether somebody is complying with them or not. And at the moment, it's a much more kind of transactional relationship, not because of that's what job centre staff necessarily want to do, it's the kind of position they're put in. And it's only through investing in that, the resources in giving advisors time to work with people and understand their situation, that they will be able to make better judgments around whether they're complying or not.
Can I just make a point that it's not necessarily the same advisor who would refer them to a decision maker if they've met the claimant commitment, the conditionality as well. There's an assumption being made that they go back and see the same person each time. I think that's the aim, but on occasions they'll go back in and there might be in a job centre somebody who's on, they call it the DMA diary, so they'd see all the people who've been referred to them that day by the band Bs, the people who do the signing. So it's that relationship isn't there, and if they fail to attend, if they miss the appointment, it's a band B decision maker who makes that decision as well. So it's not that relationship to understand what that person has done to look for work.
Right, Anne-Marie, I think is the next set.
Thank you, Chairman. Graham and I are going to look at JCP sanctioning targets, so the question principally for Mark and Helen. So if I can start perhaps with you, Mark. When Neil Cooling did his report in 2013 for the Secretary of State, he noted that when the sanctions benchmarks were removed in 2011, he suggested that conditionality was no longer being enforced appropriately by some individuals. Clearly everybody has a different view about whether or not sanction is right or wrong, but if you're employed in the system and that's the law, do you agree that your members, whatever their personal views and indeed whatever the union's views are obliged by law to, if you like, enforce the law?
Well, certainly, and bearing in mind we're representing 67,000 people working for Job Centre Plus, our view is that staff are employed as civil servants and they are obliged to carry out the duties that the law stipulates. I think the issue for us here is not whether people are applying the law, it's whether the system that has now developed actually overly emphasises the pressure on staff to make sanctions, referrals and adverse decisions, rather than emphasises most that their main key function should be to build up a relationship of trust and support and help people back into work. And we can supply, and in fact we've got evidence from staff surveys and indeed extracts from people's performance improvement plans and their appraisal interviews, where the emphasis on making sanctions, referrals and making 80% adverse decisions is astonishing. There is, for example, an effect on staff if they're not seen to be sanctioning enough. In fact, they cannot get a part of their pay rise. But there is no facility for people to be told off if they're making too many sanctioned referrals. So in other words, this whole emphasis is now, and this is our big problem, what our members tell us, that they came to this job to help people back into work, and now they feel their job is to trip people up and to find reasons why you can sanction their benefit. And that meant that the relationship of trust that is so important is breaking down. Assaults on staff have increased dramatically in the 2 years since the regime was tightened up. And what we now see is often civil servants, many of whom are fantastically low paid, 40% of whom will be entitled to universal credit, are now the target because people think it's there to blame. And I think that the pressure put on individual members of staff is distorting, therefore, the job that people should actually be doing. And I'd finally say that what we think that the reason for that is that there seems to be an obsession with designing a system for the tiny proportion who may be seeking to flout the rules, rather than a system that should be entirely geared to respect claimants, believe they do want to get back into work, and we should be helping them doing it. And that's where the service has changed so markedly, and all the evidence we have from our members is that's why Job Centre Plus is now such a worse place to work than it was previously. And I should finally add that it's not the union, therefore, who doesn't agree with the sanctions policy, because we've decided that. Our position on believing sanctions actually do not help but hinder has arrived at from the members themselves who are delivering the service, and them saying to us this is now essentially corrupting what they think they should be doing.
I hear what you say with regard to the views, but that flies in the face of your first answer, which said that clearly employees need to apply the law as it is, and they don't have free rein, if you like, to take on board their own views. And the implications of Neil Cooling's comments were that individuals, clearly not all would have been necessarily members of the union, were actually taking a view and looking at what they thought was right and fair, rather than what the current situation is. And it seems to me if you have a view about what's not working, you take that to your boss, the politicians, the unions. It's not something that you can unilaterally take on board in your decision making. Do you think that the drop in the conditionality being applied appropriately was because individuals were, if you like, making a judgment rather than just following the rules? I hear comments about the rules, but simply about the action of the members.
Yeah, in terms of Neil Cooling's report, which in May 2013, it was very, very limited. I mean, most of the evidence that he looked at, because it was meant to look at some press reports that had been leaked, showing that there were targets indeed in some areas of the country around sanctions. His investigation basically looked at those press reports, a brief discussion that he'd had with us and information that we'd supplied, and some discussions with his senior managers. I don't consider that, and I don't think anybody else would consider that a full investigation into the situation. I'm not sure where he came to the conclusion that people were choosing not to apply conditionality, given that the sanction referrals had so much increased since the change in the regime. So his investigation and the outcomes were flawed.
Okay, so fundamentally what you're saying is he didn't have enough information, wasn't looking in the right place, and that what he said wasn't true. Mm-hmm. Can I just ask you a supplementary? Clearly you don't agree with what Mr. Cooling said. Let's, for the sake of argument, say that maybe he had a point and there were some people who were inappropriately using their own judgment. And let's, for the sake of argument, say that a manager recognised that was happening. Then would you agree that it's right that a manager then take disciplinary action? I'm assuming, of course, we have an example where manager looks at individual, looks at the case, says, I think you've applied your own judgment rather than applied the system. Therefore, disciplinary action. Now, do you think that's right? Should you be entitled to do that?
Clearly, a manager has to manage, and if they believe that somebody is not applying something in the way it should be, it is right to take that up and discuss it with people. I think our evidence, however, is it's actually the opposite problem that is the one that we should worry about, which is the fact that the pressure and the targets and all the move from the top is that more and more people should be sanctioned, and that if you're not doing enough, you're penalised, but if anybody's doing too many, nobody actually looks at it. And all the internal documents, the performance appraisal sort of targets that are set, are focused on this 80% adverse decisions, and more referrals should be made. And this is why I think, from our point of view, we strongly support the call for an independent inquiry that was made, and we think it should be very far-reaching. And we think that certainly it should look at the effectiveness of sanctions, whether people who are sanctioned are actually going into work or not. What's the equality impact of sanctions on people with disabilities and mental health issues and single parents? The link between sanctions and food bank referral. But also, key point you're taking up is what's the effect of sanctions in terms of the staff and the pressure put upon them and the targets or expectations that are into the system. And I think when we do that, something profound will emerge, and it's the question we really think everybody should ask is, what is our social security system for? How do you deliver a safety net, and how do you treat people with respect, help and support them, rather than our public servants, very low people, now being seen as people who are out to trip you up, who are, if you get called in, you don't think you're being called in to be supported. Often you're being called in because someone's trying to find you out to impose a sanction, which are extraordinarily severe. There's 906,000 sanctions in 2013. There's been 1,700 sanctions that have been for 3 years. And when a sanction's imposed, of course, even if you get hardship payments, you're not getting it for the first 2 weeks. And the effect of a 4-week sanction is often someone's income is reduced by 70%. and we already have some of the lowest benefit levels of any European country. So we think the system is fundamentally flawed, but we would welcome a full independent inquiry to make our evidence to it and others to properly scrutinise. And I think Helen's point is we don't feel the previous select committee reports or DWP management, whenever they're asked, really ever do look into many of the issues we're raising today, and we think it's therefore time that was done independently.
Okay,
Okay.
to some extent.
Sorry, I was going to bring Quasi in and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. This is the first question I'm making in this session. I've heard over about an hour lots of complaints about the system and lots of individual stories suggesting that the system isn't working. What I want to know from the panel is, where is the problem? Is it that the actual sanctions, the actual concept, if you like, the philosophy of it, the idea behind it, is that the problem? Or is it a question of the implementation and the kind of operational side of things, as it were? I just want to get a sense of, as individuals who know about this area and who have experience in it, what is your thought? Are you against sanctions in principle, or are you just worried about their application as we currently see today? And I'd like to go through each of the panel just to get a sense of what your thoughts were.
Shall I start? We're not against the idea of conditions being placed in the system. What we, I think the Oakley review had a lot of very good recommendations around how the process should be improved, and I think it dealt with a lot of those issues, and we'd urge the government to implement them in full and the select committee to follow up later to review actually whether they are being implemented. I think what we need now, as Mark mentioned, is an actual look at whether the conditionality regime is working in what it intends to do. So we need a clarification of what its intention is, and we believe that should be about getting people into sustainable, good quality work. There's no evidence that it currently does so, and further, kind of the stricter regime that's brought in 2012, there's been no evidence that that in itself is necessary and has had any positive effect, though we've heard quite a lot of evidence of the kind of negative impact of that.
But you accept the principle, that's something that you don't?
Yeah, I mean, we're a work programme provider. We currently raised outs ourselves. We see in a very small number of cases that it should be a tool for advisors to use, but as other people have said, it is in a very small number of cases. The vast majority of people are very motivated to work, and at the moment it's actually pushing people further away from work. And that's why we, again, would call for a full independent review, looking at the effectiveness, not just in terms of encouraging people to engage in job search activity, which I think the Select Committee called for last time, but actually about its effectiveness of getting people into work. And to do that, we would need DWP and HMRC to do that benefit and tax data matching exercise, because we have lots of anecdotal evidence that people are coming off the system not because of actually encouraging them into work, but they just can't handle the system anymore. And it's only through that data matching exercise that we'll ever know what the long-term impact is on people.
Okay. Is that where most people on the panel broadly sit? Is that, you agree with what Mr. Robinson said?
We as a union, based on the experience of our members, we don't think sanctions is the right approach.
Okay, so that's...
We do think that it is reasonable to have some expectations on what people should do in return for their benefit, but we think the problem with the sanctions report, as we've already approached, as we tried to say, is that it skews the system.
Sure.
And our view is that if we accepted that the overwhelming bulk of people want work, then the role of Job Centre Plus should be to help provide training, support, help people back into work, and we think that would bring about a far better situation than what we've currently got. However, if there was an independent inquiry, and that wasn't what most people thought, we do also think that if you're going to have them, you must ask yourself what they're for, how are they being done, and whether it's helping the situation or making it worse. And at the moment, what we think is the evidence is it drives people into absolute poverty, doesn't help them find jobs, and actually we're not benefiting from that. We're making things worse.
But the reason why I asked the question is that there seems to be there's a big philosophical, if you like, question about whether you think sanctions are a good thing, broadly, or whether you don't. And you've been very upfront and said you don't think that's the way that we should be going, the path we should be treading. And clearly that's, I think, a fundamental difference to some of the approaches that clearly the government wants to push forward. And that I think is
there is a fundamental difference, but I think the point that we would make, I think, more strongly, is that fundamental difference probably arises because we think too much of the political approach has been about shirkers and scroungers and that people are work shy, whereas our start point from our experience is that is not where the overwhelming bulk of people are, and therefore the system's designed to deal with this problem that everybody really is worried about, rather than a system designed for the overwhelming majority, and it's doing those a disservice and the hard-working staff.
Well, you have a clear position. I mean, people could disagree with you, but that, I admit, I commend you on the clarity of your position.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the system is based on an assumption that people are somehow trying to fiddle benefits and get away with claiming job seekers allowance. This idea of people have a life of rally on benefits, and it really breaks down because it both demonises the unemployed and it pits the advisor against the claimants, which doesn't help them get into work.
So do you share Mark's view that you don't think that sanctions is the right way to go at all?
Well, yes, we're from the same opinion.
I just want to get it all down on in the public record.
Let me jump in on this. I haven't spoken so far. Sanctions aren't a one-size-fits-all policy. If you look across Europe, there's a great deal of difference in the extent of the conditionality, how harsh the penalties are. Taking where the UK system now sits, it has one of the toughest conditionality regimes and some of the harshest penalties for sanctions. Ultimately, this is a question of data, the stories behind those data, what works to get people back into jobs, reduces harm,
but what about the principle of conditionality? Is that something that you think is a useful thing? Because we've heard other panellists say that they don't think actually that makes sense in terms of trying to get good outcomes.
Again, this is a question of data, trying to
it's
make
a conceptual one. I'm afraid. It's a conceptual one. I mean, the idea of punishment or sanctions, is a concept. I mean,
I'm not opposed to the concept, but pragmatic about what's working enough. Share later data on what we've learned from looking at the UK.
No, sure, but I'm just interested in terms of what you've said. You're not opposed to the concept, and that's what I wanted to learn.
I'm not opposed to the concept.
I'm going to go back to the philosophical thing, but we're back to Anne-Marie because the key to this is do they work is one of the
But we've had clear evidence from that not many people think they do work.
Mark and Helen, you both effectively said that with regard to Neil Cooling's report, he got it wrong. Did you ever do your own investigation internally just to find out among your members whether individuals had effectively been disciplined, because that's the only way you'd have identified them, for taking a personal view rather than, if you like, applying the rules strictly, and whether any of them were disciplined for doing that?
We did, perhaps Helen will say more in a moment, we did a survey, a survey of our members who were advisors and decision makers. And actually what came back was quite startling. The headlines were that 70% of these people answering the survey said they didn't think sanctioning positively impacted on claimants finding work. We were told that 61% felt that there was pressure on them as individuals to refer claimants for sanctions, and that over 20% felt that pressure was for inappropriate referral of sanctions. And that as a result of that, what came out was that there was an 80% referral target, or adverse decision target from referrals. And so the whole emphasis of what our members were saying to us was this was where all the pressure was, and they didn't think that it was working. And the knock-on of that was they felt, therefore, it introduced fundamental barriers between the relationship between them and the public, which was the most, if you like, morale-sapping part of what information was coming back.
So there was clearly a lot of feeling that the system wasn't working, but to what extent did that impact on people's judgment and therefore the activity, how they actually did their job? Because I suppose the question I was asking was less about the research about what they thought and more about, was anybody actually disciplined because they weren't applying the rules?
Well, the survey also found that 61.8% felt they'd experienced pressure to refer claimants where they felt it was inappropriate to do so. I think you mentioned before that, just to pick up on the point you made about could people be picked up on for using their judgment? Could advisors be picked up and disciplined when actually advisors should be using their judgment? That's what part of that relationship is about. That's why they agreed at that level, because it's about discretion.
But within a framework.
Within a framework, and within this framework, 60% thought they'd been pressured to refer inappropriately. Then go on to have examples where there'd been set expectations, which is another term for a target. 10% they thought they'd been given the lower appraisal marking, because it's not disciplinary procedures to go through, it's capability or performance procedures. And as a result of that lower performance marking, they don't get part of their pay rise that year. Anecdotally, as a union rep, I've also represented quite a few members in my own job centre where they've been given that lower marking, and the reason, either kind of indirectly or sometimes directly given to that member, is because you've not made enough referrals throughout the year. And it's not necessarily, you might think, well, maybe they hadn't, but they had made some referrals, and how can it be enough unless there's a figure set? They didn't look at actually how many people got into work, you know, what were they doing as an advisor otherwise, looking at just the number of referrals.
Could I just add one, because you did ask that we've got one, if I could just read you one small extract of what one of our members has said, who's a decision maker. For obvious reasons, we wouldn't want to say who that was or what office it was, because there is a climate of fear for many job centre plus employees, but it says that at our benefit centre we are very closely monitored around sanction rates. Each week everyone is given a printout of the percentage of sanctions decisions that are being made. This is clearly a bullying tool in order to bring people into line with senior management's requirement for 80% of referrals to be a sanction. In one-to-one meetings, the managers then strongly focus on why we must achieve the 80% sanction rate. We are being forced to make adverse decisions and conducting perverse behaviours in order to achieve unachievable targets, all to get to the 80% rate of sanctioning. And that wasn't from a union rep, that was from a frontline decision maker, which we think sort of, at least in that one case, anecdotally, we hope supports the general view we're trying to get across, which is the pressure is all in one direction. And that's what people are so uncomfortable with.
I'm going to have to move on. Graham's got a short question on this one.
To Helen, we've spent a lot of time in Job Centre Plus, and I personally have 2 Job Centre Plus, and I pay tribute to your members and the staff, because the ones that I see and speak work very hard, and they're dedicated to helping people, job seekers, get work. And indeed, something's working, because unemployment's down. More people in jobs than there ever been before, and in my constituency, it is falling long-term unemployed. And the targets that you were talking about, Mark, I see targets in Job Centre Plus, and they're entirely positive, because the number of long-term unemployed are coming down, and the number of youth unemployment is coming down. So I see positive targets in Job Centre Plus. As regards to the appraisals, do you have any evidence of inappropriate targets being set in recent times? Because my feeling of Job Centre Plus is that it might be just my constituency, but I have outstanding Job Centre Pluses in my constituency. They work very hard. I'm particularly impressed with your members, and they don't seem to share your rather sanguine view on life. They work very hard and they find their job enjoyable, helping people find work.
I mean, we've given you some examples there.
Yeah, negative examples, but there's a lot of good practice out there, and we've not heard that in your evidence.
Yeah, I'm not by any means putting down the work of our members in job centres. We also think that they work extremely hard in difficult times to get people into work. But what we're saying that this doesn't help, and this is creating a negative situation. You can't say that sanctioning has somehow created a boost in the labour market and helped those people into work. We're saying our people do work hard, but this doesn't help. And these are negative targets. You also have positive targets of trying to help people into work, but if it's an 80% target on adverse decision rates, that's in the benefit centres, not in the job centres. That means they're told that 80% of the referrals that come on through, you must sanction, as well as in the job centres, they're being told you must refer more people for sanctioning. How is that positive?
Well, what my question was, I've seen no evidence of any targets for sanctions. If you've seen targets, then tell us. in recent times.
I am trying to tell you that we have
No,
seen
but tell us
evidence.
where. Tell us where, and what are you doing about it?
Well,
what can be done about it?
What we do, or what are you doing about
No,
it?
what are you doing about it?
Right. What we do about it as a union, we have armed our members and our representatives with information and with tools to go out and challenge managers. So where this comes up, we do have a good record of our representatives going to managers saying this is inappropriate behaviour, and managing to get that squashed to some extent. But you know, we're not here to police the department to that extent either. We do raise things.
I tell you what we have, the 80% that you've quoted, Mark. Is that? That's not a figure we recognise from anything we've got. Can you provide us the evidence? And I think that would help to satisfy.
We can supply all of this stuff I've got.
Right, okay,
we would just want to
useful.
anonymise it, and it's extracts from people's.
Okay.
I think that would be useful. I think that would
Because
help
one of the
to
recommendations of our investigation into Job Centre Plus was where there is examples of outstanding performance in Job Centre Plus centres, that they should be named, and that should be used as an example of best practice, which could be duplicated throughout the 700.
Graham likes best practice, and he asks that of everybody. So
Can I just say one of the problems is where we do raise it with senior management, where there is evidence of this behaviour and they don't stop when it's raised at a more lower level. It's just kind of marked off as rogue managers without any recognition that this is built into the system. This 80% target, that was actually on a letter from Jason Feeney and Neil Cooling, who were head of the Benefits and Work Services directorates at that point. So that tells you that that is endemic within the system, that it's endorsed by those senior managers.
We'll see this evidence.
It would be useful to see that.
Yeah, we'll see that.
Okay, I'm going to move on because we're now on to other targets, but off-flow targets. And Debbie's got questions here.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Professor Stuckler, if I may. And you're publishing a report today from the University of Oxford and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I wonder if you could just, and that's describing the impact of sanctions on unemployment and employment. I wonder if you could just very briefly describe what you did and what the headline findings of that. And I'm particularly interested in the pre-2012 effects on JSA claimants and the post-2012 with the introduction of the new sanctions regime.
Thanks. We took data from the Department for Work and Pensions sanction data collected across 375 local authorities in the UK and compared that with data on labour market statistics, also from official sources, on unemployment benefits and employment rates. And then we compared the pre-2011 and post-2011 period when the UK coalition government began to reform the work and sanctions regime. What we found is that over the entire period we looked, 2005 to 2014, for every 100 sanctions, about 24 people were flowing off unemployment benefit. After the reforms came into effect, this heightened so that about 43 people for each 100 sanctioned were leaving the system. We then looked at those who were leaving in association with the sanction. We found that fewer than 20% were returning to work. The rest were for other and sometimes unspecified reasons, ceasing to sign on. We also looked to see if we could find an effect on employment rates and of sanctioning across the local authorities and didn't find it. So that led us to the conclusion that sanctions appear to be driving people off benefit, but few return to work.
Thank you. That's very clear. So 43% currently, since the 2012 regime, people who are JSA claimants who are sanctioned leave JSA, and 80% do so for reasons other than employment. That's quite significant figures. Today we're publishing, or the ONS will be publishing JSA claimant count figures. And if you estimate that in December 60,000 JSA claimants would have been sanctioned, that would suggest then that the unemployment figures, based on the estimates that you have suggested, will be about 25 1,000 lower than they actually are. Would you agree with that?
We haven't made that specific calculation, which is difficult to do in part because our data that were the latest available from official sources only went up to March 2014 at the time. So we'd be extrapolating. Some people also received multiple sanctions, and in the data we analyzed, there could be some small degree of double counting. But if you extrapolate the 43% estimate, that it could be as high as the number you suggest.
Thank you. What do you think is happening to the people that leave?
It's a very good question, and unfortunately one that we're not able to answer with the quantitative data that we have. We're following up with qualitative work in some of the regions of the UK that have some of the highest rates of sanctions being imposed, such as Derby. We're also looking at Oxford, Manchester, and a few other sites.
Okay. And what do you think should happen then? What sort of investigation do you think needs to be followed on from your work in terms of the qualitative and longitudinal study as well?
One concern we have is that if, as our data show, people are not receiving benefit but also not into work, this puts them in a highly precarious, vulnerable situation. There's evidence from other countries that when people encounter this precarious situation, they interact with highly costly social institutions, hospitals, jails, homeless shelters, emergency food banks and shelters, which can cost net more to taxpayers. So we look to perform a full cost-benefit analysis that looks not just narrowly at employment, but the wider and potentially hidden costs of sanction.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Stuckler.
Can I just get Nigel in?
So just a quick question, Professor Stuckler. I was just trying to work through the numbers you were quoting, and I was looking at your figure 3 in the report you've published today, which says of 46 who receive an adverse decision, 20 move off JSA, 3.5 for work, 16.4 to unknown destinations, and none for other reasons. So when you say fewer than 20% find work of those 20 that leave, I mean, how many of those 16.4 to unknown do you actually know didn't go into work?
16.4 to unknown. Well, so job centers, when they close an unemployment benefit claim, record the reasons why.
Sometimes.
And the majority of cases, it's correct, it was made optional in 2009, but over the period we've looked, it's hovered at about 55% were and still recorded in the system. And the job center staff would like to be able to goad persons as having found work. So we think these data would overstate the extent to which people who leave are finding work. And our calculation was based on those job centers.
If I've been sanctioned, I'm not going to be desperately keen to ring up and tell the job centre I've just found work, am I? I mean, there must be a little bit of fear here that actually this unknown could be completely unknown. It could be a decent chunk of those could have been going into work. You just don't know, I guess. Is that which kind of makes the finding a little shaky, doesn't it?
It's covering, again, 55% of those leaving. I do a lot of work in epidemiology, and that's a good response rate that's used for many studies of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, breast cancer, to name a few. But it would just point to the need to collect data, ideally longitudinally and at the individual level, as has been done in other countries, that can give more definitive answers to these questions about where people are going.
But there's no data yet. There was no way in your study of looking at real-time information feeds from PAYE data to actually check whether people who had been sanctioned and got off benefits were having tax or NI recorded against them. That kind of study hasn't been done, and that data wasn't available to you, in fact.
The real-time data with precise categorization of destinations, unfortunately, is not available. But it would be possible to do. Other countries have done it.
Can I just ask, I'll come back to you in a minute. Can I just ask in terms of, about the targets and whether there's targets for sanction. In the research you've done, were you able to see whether there was difference in sanction rates across the country? You know, that some areas have high sanction rates and some others are not. And what were the characteristics of the ones that had high and the ones that had low sanctioning rates?
Yes, that's a good point. There's a remarkable degree of variation in the extent to which sanctions are being imposed in different regions, as high and above 10% in Derby, Preston, and a few other local authorities we cite in the paper, and lower, below 3% in others. We haven't gotten to investigating the reasons for those discrepancies, but that's the next step we're taking.
There's no correlation between areas of high unemployment have high sanction rates, or you know, I've got an area of fairly low unemployment, but I don't know whether sanction rates are therefore higher or lower because of that, because the cohort that are reporting to Job Centre Plus are the ones who are much harder and further away from the labour market. Yeah. Otherwise, they would be in a job in what was until the oil price collapse, a very buoyant labour market. Yeah. I'm going to have to change what I say now.
That's something we're looking into in the international literature. There's been a suggestion that sanctions work less well where jobs are scarce and unemployment is high. So that's we'll get back to you when we have answers.
Very quickly, one for you, Professor Stuckler, as a follow-up. I mean, you rightly have included confidence intervals in the sensitivity analysis there. So there is considerable confidence in terms of the figures that you have produced. Appreciate that these statistical models are difficult to understand to a lay person. But also, aren't JCP, they're incentivised for follow-up, so you would expect that there would be a degree of confidence from that perspective. Can I, thank you, Professor Stuckler's nodding to that. Can I just move on to Mark and Helen very briefly? From your experience about offload, the Minister has denied that there are any targets around sanctions, as you probably know. And although we have been pushing for an independent inquiry, the government haven't been forthcoming, although they initially said about 15 months ago that they would. But from your experience, what proportion of sanctioned people will go off slow as a result of that?
It's difficult for us to determine that because it's not fully recorded by the department. But in terms of offload, that is a published target, and our experience is that there is a focus on getting claimants off the books, so to speak, by any means. So with offload being that primary target, and if you can't get people into work, there's only one other way that you can get people off the benefit counts for that week and to meet those cohort targets that they have. And as Mark said before, we fully agree that it should be an fully independent review that looks at the sanction regime as a whole rather than just individual areas of issues, because the problem with having these individual areas is that it can sometimes lead to negative and perverse behaviours. So if you look at the cancellation rates or, you know, number of referrals that don't result in a sanction being applied, that's where you get this practice where they brought it in about 80% of referrals must now result in a sanction to try and even it out, but that's obviously the wrong approach to take.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And our last section before everybody disappears off, Teresa, who wasn't here at the beginning, but she had a good excuse. She had a Westminster Hall debate.
Thank you. Yeah, apologies for not being here earlier. On the subject of sanctions, obviously we've got the discussion as to are they relevant, do they work? So if we're looking at do they work, and we think they don't, I'm not saying we do, but if we think they don't, what other alternatives could there be? I'd just like to ask Steve Hughes, because your organisation Policy Exchange has looked at this and you recommended that the DWP pilot a yellow card system, which could be that benefits are paid on a card rather than a financial sanction. Could you just talk a little bit about how that would work?
Yeah, sure. I outlined a little bit at the start of the session, but the basic principle is that for a lower tier first sanction, the claim there wouldn't be a financial sanction. It would be a non-financial sanction. And to pilot whether that non-financial sanction would drive better engagement with the job centre as well. So there's two elements to it. The first is payments in a different method other than the claimant is used to recognise the fact that it is different. The claimant has gone through a sanction, and that would be paid on a prepaid card, as well as and twinned with daily sign-on as well, or more regular sign-on with the job centre. Now, there are problems with this, obviously. I mean, there's, for example, it might cost the claimant a lot more to sign on with the job centre on a more daily basis. It might cost money to implement a prepaid card system as well. Prepaid card systems do exist in other countries such as Australia and America, but not for the purpose of sanctions. So the technology does exist, but not for necessarily.
So what would be the
purpose.
difference to somebody between getting their money in cash and getting them into their bank account and getting their same amount of money on a card?
So it'd be the recognition that you have done, ultimately the claimant.
So it's just stigma, is that what you're saying?
Stigma, well, recognition that you've done something different.
But what difference would it make to the individual?
Well, it'd be recognition to them that they have had a sanction applied to them and that they're not receiving their benefit in the same way anymore.
So that's the only difference. It would be just they could use the card exactly as they could the cash.
Yeah, I mean, we did outline in the report as well is that you could use these cards to apply different methods of sanction to it as well. So, for example, again, in Australia and America, there are methods of controlling what can be purchased with the cards. The difficulty with that is that you require technology on behalf of, say, the retailer to develop that system. Now, it's important to point out that we didn't just say that is what should be applied, but it is a potential method of non-financial sanction. Really, the point that we made was it's about non-financial sanctions.
So it's a discussion point as looking at alternatives rather than you think it's actually the answer?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So, Ben Robinson, your research has concluded that actually helping people back into work and building the potential for them to job seek, one of the things that's key to that is a strong trusting relationship between the claimant and the advisor, and that's a really key element. Do you think that the potential financial sanctions has an impact on that relationship? Do you think that when the person you're meant to trust and engage with is the person who can stop your money, do you think that that's a
It certainly can be. I mean, we did a survey with the Employment Related Services Association that surveying a number of work programme providers, and the feedback from that was 60% of advisors thought it did have a negative impact, but I think it was about the same proportion also thought that it should be part of the system. So it does have the potential.
As a tool,
yeah.
But, yeah.
I mean, I would just say, I mean, I agree with Steve that we do need we need an alternative for the first sanction, a non-financial sanction, and we would say that, agreeing with somebody from the previous panel about a first warning system, so that would give an opportunity to check whether the claim commitment was appropriate, to check in, to ensure that it's kind of appropriate to their current situation, as well as signifying that there has been an offence. That's a more appropriate way of doing it without kind of causing the kind of confusion as well as the stigma attached to the kind of
So do you think there's any evidence that financial sanctions actually drive behaviour?
Well, we would strongly urge a review to see whether it does actually improve job outcomes. I mean, anecdotally from some of our work, as I said before, we believe it can do in a very small number of cases, only where the primary barrier is attitudinal. As I said, the vast majority of people do want to find work, and therefore it shouldn't be, I mean, the severity of sanctions at the moment is so out of proportion to probably the benefits that it could cause. If you see what I mean.
So what you would suggest is, as a first instance, some sort of marker, but not necessarily a financial sanction. Have you any thoughts on what that could be? Would it just a verbal warning, or actually something else happens, or increased signing on, or what have you?
Well, I mean, not dissimilar to say a normal workplace where you maybe having a formal official warning, where you would check whether the conditions placed on people are appropriate, but also the level of support that they're receiving is also appropriate. So this gets back to the idea that claimant commitment is a reciprocal arrangement where they can expect a certain level of support from the job centre, as well as a kind of an appropriate assessment of their situation. as well as kind of the number of kind of requirements on them as well, before kind of the financial sanction kicks in. I mean, we would also say that while that review is taking place, we would strongly urge the system to revert back to before 2012, before it became that much more stringent, because there's just no evidence that that increased severity has had any positive impact on job outcomes at all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've exhausted our time, but probably not our questions. But if we can have the extra evidence, that would be grateful. Just to point out, the reason for this inquiry is that we thought we got the Minister to agree to the independent inquiry you mentioned in your evidence, and discovered that she hadn't. So that's part of the reason for us holding this inquiry. But we don't have, as a select committee of the House of Commons, the breadth of ability to do a full independent inquiry that the government can commission. So, so that's part of the thing that lies behind the reasons behind us looking at this. But it's obviously an important issue and affects not just your members in the PCS, but actually all of our constituents who are affected by the sanctioning regime. So, thank you very much for coming along this morning. Your evidence will be very useful for when we come to write a report. So thank you very much. Order.